Hi, this is Joan Kowalski, president of Bob Ross Incorporated, and you're listening to IP Fridays podcast.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of IP Fridays. Our names are Ken Suzanne and Rolf Claessen, and this is the podcast dedicated to intellectual property. It does not matter where you are from, in-house or private practice, novice or expert. We will help you stay up to date with current topics in the fields of trademarks, patents, design and copyright, discover useful tools, and much more.
I am Rolf Claessen, and together with my co-host Ken Suzanne, I welcome you to episode 157 of IP Fridays. Today in the IP Fridays podcast, my co-host Ken Suzanne interviews Joan Kowalski, president of Bob Ross Incorporated, about the famous painter Bob Ross and how to protect and enforce the rights of Bob Ross. Before we jump into the interview, I have news for you. The USPTO recently terminated proceedings in about 3,100 patent applications due to the fraudulent use of signatures. These cases involve the improper entry of the S signature, where someone other than the registered practitioner submitted the signature. The USPTO took this action to uphold the integrity of its processes, signaling a firm stance against fraudulent practices in the patent filings. Moderna is hit with 2 patent lawsuits over COVID vaccine technology. Northwestern University alleges that Moderna used its patented lipid nanoparticle technology in COVID-19 vaccine without permission. Meanwhile, GlaxoSmithKline claims Moderna infringed on its patents related to mRNA stabilization in both COVID-19 and RSV vaccines. These cases could impact Moderna's vaccine technology moving forward. China's National Intellectual Property Administration released its report on patent-intensive industries just a couple of days ago, revealing that these sectors now contribute to over 13% of China's gross domestic product. The report highlights that continued growth in industries driven by patents, such as technology and pharmaceuticals, with rising patent filings and authorizations. This reflects China's increasing emphasis on innovation and intellectual property as key drivers of its economic development. South Korea is tackling a 17 billion intellectual property theft problem, with 97 incidents of attempted IP theft targeting key industries like semiconductors and display technology. Over 60% of these breaches involve insider actions. The South Korean government is stepping up efforts by implementing technology leakage prevention systems and increasing penalties for offenders. These measures aim to protect national core technologies that are vital to the country's economic and technological leadership, especially in the field like semiconductors. The Select Committee of the European Patent Organization recently welcomed the progress of the unitary patent system with over 40,000 requests for unitary effect submitted. The unitary patent now covers more than a quarter of all European patents, with Romania's accession further expanding its reach. The strong uptake highlights the growing popularity of the system among users, solidifying its role in simplifying patent protection across Europe. Now I hand the stage over to my co-host Ken Suzanne, who interviewed Joan Kowalski, president of Bob Ross Incorporated.
Our guest today on the IP Fridays podcast is Joan Kowalski. Joan is the president of Bob Ross Inc. Bob Ross is a true icon in the art world. He is an American painter, art instructor, and both creator and host of the acclaimed television series The Joy of Painting, which aired from 1983 through 1994 on public television, both in the United States and in other markets around the world. Joan started working for Bob Ross Inc. in 1988, a few years after graduating from college. She answered 1-800 number phone calls, wrote letters, and processed mail orders with Jane Ross as her supervisor. On the official website for Bob Ross at bobross.com, Bob's legacy is captured best. Quote, he's recognized everywhere as one of the most iconic and memorable personalities on public television. With his gentle approach and homespun humor, Bob Ross has taught, inspired, and entertained millions of people around the country and around the world. Close quote. Branding, licensing, monitoring, and enforcement are front and center for Bob Ross Inc. And I am pleased to have Joan Kowalski on our podcast today so we can get a clear picture on how this innovative company protects the valuable IP of Bob Ross worldwide. Welcome, Joan, to the IP Fridays podcast.
Hi, Kenneth. Thank you for having me.
Joan, can you tell our listeners a bit about your family, their relationship to Bob Ross, and how you became president of Bob Ross Inc.?
I sure can. My mother took a painting class with Bob all the way back, probably in 1982. She thought he was so remarkable that she went home that night and told my father, I think I've stumbled on something. Let's have dinner with him one night and talk to him. And so they went to the local Waffle House because Bob loved eating breakfast for dinner. Mm-hmm. And they talked a little bit about what they could do to enhance his attendance in his classes. He was teaching up and down the East Coast pretty much. And they just sort of talked, and Bob told them some of his dreams and ideas. And they decided to form a little company and promote Bob wherever they could. And the classes turned into a television series, turned into what you see today. We couldn't be more proud.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive right into the IP issues, Joan. What are some of the key issues that face your company with respect to protecting Bob Ross's IP?
There are some challenges, certainly. Most notably, when your intellectual property is a person, as opposed to, a piece of art or a storyline or a book or something like that. When you are protecting a person, it's a different ball game, sort of. First of all, in that most people don't realize that you can protect a person, his image, his name, the way he speaks, his voice, his mannerisms, his little quotes that he uses. These are, in fact, all protectable, which I think the vast majority of the public don't realize. And that, I would say, is our biggest challenge, is trying to sort of overcome the idea that he's sort of a public domain figure, or he's something that is sort of free to everyone to use, that his family is the owner. Those sorts of things. I think the biggest challenge being, protecting a person. It's called right of publicity, and not everybody understands it.
Mm-hmm. What about the internet, Joan? How has the internet impacted brand protection, and what are some of the ways in which you monitor for infringing activity?
So the internet is both a gem, a treasure, and a curse, which is probably true of anybody that has the need to protect intellectual property. You can lose control as it just sort of morphs farther and farther away from the core, and it just sort of becomes its own thing. That you then have to try and rein in, explain that this isn't necessarily, because it's on the internet, it's not necessarily available to you for your product. And it doesn't help also that Bob Ross being just such a gentle, wonderful man, that he still did have in place certain controls over, the way that people would portray him both in life and online. And it's just hard. I would say again, the public just doesn't necessarily understand, and the internet just doesn't wholly understand that it's not just a free for all.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the tools that you use to find out what's going on? Do you work with services to monitor for infringement, or do you yourself look at the internet, or do you have fans that are writing to you, or is it a combination of all of these things?
So I will tell you that we do use a monitoring organization, and we've given them, all of our literally hundreds of trademark certificates from that we've applied for and been granted from around the world. They've put all of that into their database, and they go to town and they start just scrubbing the internet of infringements.
Mm-hmm.
And again, right of publicity was sort of a hard concept for us to explain even to the monitoring system, but they're getting the hang of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you also that we get a lot of emails from fans that just want to make sure they know that we are ferocious in making sure that Bob is shown and identified in the best positive light. We get a lot of emails from them saying, such and such company is using Bob's face, and I just don't like it, and I don't think you will either. We get a
Sure.
lot. Our fans are like our little policemen. They know that the goal is to keep Bob as wonderful as he is.
Yes. Now, I've seen a lot of merchandise in the last few years in my travels. I assume these were all mostly licensed products. What's driving this trend, and can you comment on the need to protect IP?
Yes. So the reason for the sudden, maybe in the last, I'd say 5, 6, 7 years, you may
Mm-hmm.
have started noticing a lot of product, a lot of non-painting products like socks and sweaters and
Yes.
t-shirts and puzzles and that sort of thing. And that comes from, first and foremost, Bob experienced an enormous and just lovely resurgence when we allowed Twitch TV, which is a very it's something that the kids watch. Twitch TV, they play
Yes.
video games on it. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they were opening a new channel called Creative, and they wanted to do a Bob Ross marathon to open this channel like 7-ish years ago. And it was a huge success, a huge success. And this just created it didn't really create Bob Ross fans. They had always been fans. They just didn't know that half of their friends were already fans and half of their family were already fans. It's like fans identified each other with each other, and it just exploded. It just exploded. And in response to that, we did start doing finally what Bob had always wanted, which was to kind of become a household name. And so we started satisfying this younger generation with lots and lots of products that they could enjoy and collect. And today's younger generation loves to collect things and show them off to their friends and that sort of thing. So that's where, but then again, that's where we realized the intellectual property, the images, the name, the voice, his little quotes, that sort of thing, started leaving us started floating out farther and farther from our arm's reach.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about the time also that we determined that we could not scour the internet by ourselves anymore, which we had been doing for years, but just in-house, but that we had to, sort of find ways to reach out as far as the intellectual property was going, to try and maintain. There are certain things that Bob really, really wanted, and that sort of fit into this. The one thing that I can think of is he was very, very proud of his painting technique, and he didn't really want his name being used for other painting techniques. He had worked hard to develop this wet on wet technique of his. And so that's one thing that we were, and still are, having to really be careful of, is that people aren't using his name and face to show other forms of painting with teachers that are not certified. Though that sort of thing is really, really, really bothered Bob and made him worry that the technique of his would sort of fade away as more and more people started sort of using his image to describe and teach other methods of painting. So that's one thing that we're doing a lot of. The other thing is that because there are not a lot of Bob Ross original paintings for sale out in the wild, we're now having to deal with forgeries, which is something a little bit new for us. But we're working on that as well. It's funny because people that aren't really used to art and studying various artists, Bob's fans by and large aren't studying artists and going to museums and that sort of thing. Their approach to art is something they can do themselves. And normally, if they see a painting that's got a tree in it, they just naturally assume that Bob painted it. And forgers are sort of taking advantage of that. They'll take a painting that's not a Bob Ross painting, but it's a landscape, and they'll forge his signature on there and try to sell it. So we're having to work with our monitor and with our attorneys with that particular subject, which is awfully painful. And I think Bob would have been terrified to think that people were doing that.
Yes. And another thing Bob probably would take issue at are these NFTs. I had read a few years ago that NFTs are an issue for your company. What do you do to protect against unauthorized NFTs bearing Bob's work or likeness and image?
So NFTs are a very interesting animal. They're maybe 3 years ago, they were absolutely the biggest thing ever. And we were very careful to only license maybe 2 of our licensees with the ability to create one NFT. We were really mostly for the ability to monitor. We weren't going gung-ho with NFTs so that we could watch better, and so that we knew that if there were only these 2, Funko was one of the companies that we licensed an NFT to. But that we could chase and monitor and make sure that it wasn't going out of control. So we were very hesitant to sign on with NFT creators, and there were bunches that came to us. And we knew that NFTs, unless it was Funkos, could be scrubbed from the internet. Now, the good news is, or maybe not good news, but the thing about NFTs is they have quieted down quite a bit now. And they're really, our monitor, again, is just in all the NFT marketplaces. daily, and they've only found one in a very long time that is using our intellectual property to create NFTs. So I think the reason that we were able to sort of maintain and protect in regards to NFTs is because we just didn't give licenses out like
You had a tight control over the market. Yeah.
Very tight control. And I'll tell you why, is because I didn't understand NFTs enough to feel comfortable to hand out licenses. It's a silly reason, but I just could never wrap my head around the appeal or how they work and what they were. But boy, we got pressure like crazy. We got inquiries daily to get a license for NFTs, and we just held back on that. And I think in the end, mostly just to be able to control and to watch and be able to see clearly what is an infringement and what has to be studied and that sort of thing.
Joan, let's talk about AI, because there's not a day that goes by that I don't hear something about AI. Are you worried about the threat of AI? Have you seen anything yet with respect to Bob's image and likeness and voice? What are your plans in dealing with AI?
I think everybody's a little nervous about AI, and it could also be because, again, I don't think we have a full understanding of it. I only know that we're being infringed on in regards to AI when I see it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to explain it to you from the ground up because it's just still very complicated in my mind. But again, with AI, and we are seeing some images that are being created of Bob. Lately, we've been seeing a lot of pictures of Bob looking like he's been beat up and bleeding and, black eyes and cuts on his face and that sort of thing. And that's when I know that AI has been in play, because it's clearly not real, but it sure does look like him. So there is fear always in that way. It's not like it used to be where you could just tell automatically that this was a picture that was taken from somewhere and used for something, end of story. But now with this, there's, and again, I think it has to do with just not handing out licenses right and left and worrying about the consequences later. We've been approached by lots of entities that we've rejected, a licensing opportunity just because the protection, the more you give out, the more you're having to monitor and protect. So we're a little bit choosy, and I think we'll be the same where AI is concerned if it's controllable. Again, I have to say that with us having the protective tool of right of publicity, it does help that it's much more definable, that the person, if used in commerce, and Bob had granted right of publicity to his company, that you can more quickly and easily identify AI, fake voice sounds, fake signatures, fake faces, AI generated sort of things that normally, if it's a person and you've got right of publicity, it's an easier go to attempt to protect and enforce and litigate if needed.
Earlier this year, Joan, in March, the state of Tennessee signed into law the Ensuring Likeness, Voice, and Image Security Act, or known as the Elvis Act, which is designed to protect musicians from the unauthorized use of artificial intelligence. In particular, this state law prohibits people from using AI from mimicking an individual's voice without first obtaining their permission. Violation carries a Class A misdemeanor under Tennessee law, and civil actions can also be filed. Your thoughts about this new law?
I actually, when I heard about it, I freaked out a little bit because it's almost identical to what it is that we've been able to protect through right of publicity. Voice, people don't understand that your voice is still yours. It is protectable depending on, how you do that, whether the person is living or deceased. And it's very close. I've read a little bit about it, and it's just sort of very close to what we're dealing with protecting the Bob Ross, the full person. And I think that I think that the idea that you don't have to sort of splice away and explain using somebody's voice or mimicking somebody's voice is really the same as using somebody's face or name. There isn't any, if protected properly, and if given the rights to the certain attributes of a human, it makes it just a lot easier moving forward.
But with respect to the right of publicity, Joan, I understand back in 2018 that your company ran into a challenge with respect to the right of publicity. What was that challenge, and can you comment on how that was resolved?
We were challenged in 2018 simply because of, again, the public not understanding right of publicity. And by public, I mean that one of Bob's family members didn't understand Bob's company and what he had set up within his corporation that would then carry us after his death into being able to, in his honor, commercialize his features, his being. And again, I think because what I said at the top of the hour, how it's a hard concept unless you really understand it. So the family member just did sort of naturally assume that Bob, being his relative, and a lot of the public behind him, thinking that these Bob Ross attributes would belong to Bob's family. Now, the part that was missing was that Bob had already granted the rights to the right of publicity to his company that he and three other partners, his wife and my parents, had already granted to the corporation back in the 1980s, that he wanted, and he knew that the company could do what he wanted once he died. And this is the reason that he granted these rights to the company, so that we could continue. We've been at this for 40 years now. I think we're doing pretty good. Do you agree?
Yeah, oh, yes. No,
Yes.
I've been a fan of Bob Ross for many, many years. So it's certainly an honor to talk with you.
That is wonderful.
We're coming up towards the end of our interview today, but I was wondering, can you provide to our listeners any best practices, for protecting IP? What should they be doing? Are there things that you do regularly that you could share with them?
I would say I have two things, and I'm so glad you're asking. The first thing being to be a little bit choosy about who you give a license to, and not because you do or don't like the product, or do or don't like the company or whatever, but it just makes it easier to protect your assets when you are very sort of diligent in who you give a license to. If you start sending licenses to everyone that inquires, it just gets farther and farther and farther away from you. The second thing I would suggest is don't try to protect everything yourself. We did try to do that for years, and it just something that goes out into the internet just multiplies like crazy.
Yes.
And you need a professional monitor to help with that.
Very, very important words of wisdom. Joan, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today on the IP Fridays podcast. This has been fascinating, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode. If you liked what you heard, please show us your love by visiting ipfridays.com/love and tweet a link to this show. We would be so grateful if you would do that. It would help us out to get the word out. Also, please subscribe to our podcast at ipfridays.com or on iTunes or Stitcher.com. If you have a question or want to be featured in one of the upcoming episodes, please send us your feedback at ipfridays.com/feedback. Also, please leave us a review on iTunes. You can go to ipfridays.com/iTunes and it will take you right to the correct page on iTunes. If you want to get mentioned on this podcast or even have comments within the next episode, please leave us your voicemail at ipfridays.com/voicemail. You have been listening to an episode of IP Fridays. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by their respective law firms. None of the content should be considered legal advice. The IP Fridays podcast should not be construed as legal advice or legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The contents of this podcast are intended for general informational purposes only, and you are urged to consult your own lawyer on any specific legal questions. As always, consult a lawyer or patent or trademark attorney. Copyright 2014, all rights reserved.